Hi, I'm Pat.
And I'm Jesse.
Welcome to the Deep Dive.
We are so glad you can join us today. We're diving into something, well, really important and honestly something that touches so many more lives than we often think about.
That's right. We're exploring trauma today, specifically the uh, the deep, lasting ways it can affect us. It's not just, a psychological thing in your head.
No, not at all. It's something that gets lodged in our bodies. It actually changes our brains, shapes how we relate to others, and, well, incredibly, it can even seem to echo down through generations.
It's definitely complex, often hidden, but trying to understand it feels really vital.
It does. So today we're going to explore this using some really insightful material. We've looked at things like research studies, articles from clinicians, perspectives from organizations doing amazing work with survivors.
And even some personal experiences shared online that give, a different kind of understanding, a different lens.
Yeah. Think of this deep dive as maybe exploring a landscape together.
I like that. We're looking at what that internal terrain feels like, how it influences the paths we take with other people, and what some of the signposts towards healing might actually look like.
We really want this to feel personal, empathetic, almost like we're trying to understand a story that's playing out quietly or loudly in so many lives around us, maybe even yours.
Absolutely. We'll touch on what happens in the body and the brain, how it impacts our emotional world, our connections.
And then we'll look at some paths toward healing. We'll even talk about a specific body-oriented group therapy approach and wrestle a bit with the role, which can sometimes be tricky, of practices like mindfulness.
Okay, let's jump in then. When we talk about trauma, especially these really deep effects, a term that comes up a lot in the sources is complex trauma.
Yes, exactly. You might hear complex trauma or maybe chronic traumatization. Organizations like the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, the NCTSN, and also Beacon House, they stress that this isn't usually about one single event.
Right, not like a car crash necessarily.
More often, it's prolonged, it's repeated, and it happens within relationships, especially important ones, and often starting in childhood. So things like ongoing abuse or neglect, or living in really unstable, unpredictable homes where, well, where the person who's supposed to care for you might also be the source of the fear or harm.
And the impact of that.
Yeah.
It's profound, isn't it? The sources say it fundamentally messes with your body's automatic pilot, your autonomic nervous system.
Yeah, it's like your internal alarm system gets stuck in the on position. It's constantly scanning for danger, even when objectively you're safe right now. Your body feels like it's under threat.
It makes sense when you think about those basic animal defenses, fight, flight, freeze.
Right, or collapse, or even that cry for help response. In a healthy system, those things kick in, help you survive, and then you kind of settle back down.
But with chronic trauma, especially if you couldn't fight or escape, maybe as a child,
Exactly. Those responses get stuck. They become chronic. And the sources are really clear. This constant state of activation, especially during those critical developmental years, it has lasting detrimental effects on the brain, the body itself, your sense of who you are and how you connect with others and the world.
which leads us right into talking about those far-reaching effects. It's such a common idea that trauma is just in your head.
Oh, absolutely. But the sources just hammer home. Trauma lives in the body. It really, truly does.
How does that show up?
Well, the NCTSM points out it can manifest as chronic physical stuff that doctors maybe can't easily explain, constant headaches, stomach aches, muscle pain. It actually impairs your immune system.
And those stress response systems we just mentioned, they get worn down.
Exactly. When your body is perpetually in that survival gear, it literally wears down your physical health over time. It's exhausting on a biological level.
There was that fascinating point in the sources about body dysregulation. It sounded almost counterintuitive.
Yeah, it's like the thermostat for your sensory world gets broken. So survivors might be hypersensitive, sounds feel deafening, lights painfully bright, touch might feel overwhelming or even threatening.
Or the opposite.
Or, yeah, the complete opposite. They can be significantly undersensitive, sometimes even to the point of not really being aware of physical pain or injuries, which, can be dangerous in itself.
And there was that powerful idea from Beacon House about why that might happen, especially with really early trauma.
Oh, yes. If a baby's cries, their earliest way of saying, "I'm distressed, help me, soothe me," are consistently met with anger or panic or just absence from the caregiver instead of comfort.
They learned something devastating.
They learned a terrible lesson. My feelings are dangerous. My internal state hurts others or it brings me hurt. And that isn't just a thought. It becomes this deeply wired physical rule about emotions and body sensations.
Wow, so the body learns to brace for danger from the inside, or just disconnect.
Precisely. Which, of course, connects directly to the emotional impact. Sources talk about real difficulty even knowing what you're feeling sometimes,
Or expressing it.
or expressing it in a balanced way, managing those really intense waves of emotion. Feelings can seem totally unpredictable, overwhelming, maybe explosive.
Triggered by small things.
Yeah, triggered by things in the present that might not seem like a big deal, but they unconsciously touch on that bodily memory of past threat. And then there's the flip side, emotional numbing.
Which starts as protection.
Absolutely. A necessary shield to just survive something unbearable.
Yeah.
But later, that numbness can leave you feeling really detached, empty, or even vulnerable because you're not getting important information from your feelings.
And then there's dissociation. That's the mind kind of checking out.
Kind of, yeah. It's the mind's incredible ability, really, to separate itself from overwhelming experiences to survive them. It might feel like you're watching yourself from outside your body or like the world isn't quite real.
Or just gaps in memory.
Yes, or gaps in awareness. And the sources explain that once your brain learns dissociation as a survival tool, it can just happen automatically later on whenever you feel stressed or triggered, even subtly.
Which must make daily life hard.
It really can. Makes it hard to focus, to learn, to stay present in relationships. To an outsider, it might just look like someone is spacing out a lot.
The cognitive effects, the thinking effects are also huge, aren't they?
Definitely. When your brain is pouring all its energy into survival mode, scanning for danger, readying those defense responses, there are fewer resources left for the higher level thinking parts.
So things like
Trouble with clear thinking, planning ahead, solving problems, making decisions, even learning new things. Difficulty just sustaining attention, being easily distracted, especially by anything that feels even remotely like a potential threat.
And memory gets affected too, you mentioned.
Right. It's interesting what the sources call explicit memory, your ability to consciously recall facts and the sequence of events that can be impaired. The stress hormones actually damage brain areas involved in that.
But implicit memory, the body memory.
That can be incredibly strong, especially for threat. Your body and your emotional brain might remember exactly how to react to a certain trigger, that feeling of panic, the urge to flee, even if you can't consciously remember the specific past event that first linked that trigger to danger.
Yeah. And since complex trauma so often happens in relationships, especially with parents or caregivers.
Yeah. It fundamentally impacts your ability to form healthy, secure attachments later. Trust becomes incredibly difficult. If the people who were supposed to be your safe harbor were actually the source of the storm, how do you learn to trust anyone?
It makes sense that it would create challenges in friendships, romantic partnerships, even relating to authority figures.
Absolutely. It casts a long shadow.
And stepping back even further, the sources highlight some really stark long-term consequences, health-wise, economically.
Yes. Research like the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, the ACE study, drew direct lines between various types of childhood trauma and a much higher risk of serious health problems later in life. Things like heart disease, diabetes, autoimmune disorders, even early death.
And the cost to society.
Huge. Estimates run into the hundreds of billions of dollars annually, just in the U.S., when you factor in healthcare costs, lost work productivity, involvement in the justice system, and so on. It's clearly not just a private struggle, it's a major public health issue.
It really shows the depth of it all.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily stop with the person who directly experienced the trauma, does
I
it?
know, that's the really sobering part. Which brings us to this idea of intergenerational trauma.
How the effects can sort of ripple down through a family.
Exactly. The sources talk about a few ways this can happen. One is pretty direct. If a parent is struggling with their own unresolved trauma symptoms, maybe severe anxiety, depression, emotional volatility, substance use, that can create an environment for their child that is itself frightening or unpredictable.
So the parent's trauma becomes traumatizing for the child.
It can, yes. Another layer is environmental factors, especially there's linked to historical trauma affecting whole groups of people, like, say, the ongoing effects of systemic racism or colonization, leading to cycles of poverty, lack of access to good care, chronic stress, discrimination. These things absolutely perpetuate distress across generations.
And then there was that really cutting-edge idea about epigenetics.
Right. One source touched on this. It's the science looking at how experiences might actually change the way our genes work, not the DNA code itself, but which genes get turned on or off.
So trauma could potentially leave a biological mark.
Potentially, yes. The idea is that severe stress or trauma might cause epigenetic changes that affect things like the stress response system, that HPA axis we mentioned, the body's main stress control in the children or maybe even grandchildren,
Making them more sensitive to stress themselves.
possibly making them more biologically vulnerable. Or, yes, sources explain it's really sensitive to those high levels of stress hormones, like cortisol, that flood the system during trauma. That damage can impair the ability to form a clear, coherent narrative memory of the event.
But the feeling of danger gets stored somewhere else.
Right, often in the amygdala and in the body itself. And then up front, you have the prefrontal cortex. That's your thinking cap, basically.
Planning, logic, impulse control.
Exactly. Decision-making, regulating your emotions. Its function gets dampened or goes offline when the brain switches into survival mode. The key takeaway from the neurobiology is that those older, faster survival parts, the amygdala, the brainstem, they react first and much faster than the thinking, reasoning prefrontal cortex.
Which explains why triggers can be so powerful and immediate.
Precisely. Sensory input sights, sounds, smells, touch can instantly activate that fear response because the brain has learned to associate them with danger through that fear conditioning process.
Smell is particularly strong, you mentioned.
Yeah, smell is interesting because it has a more direct route to the limbic system, the emotional brain, bypassing some of the usual processing stations. And another point sources make is that survivors might actually perceive sensory input differently. Sounds might seem louder, smells stronger. Their whole perception potentially colored by that constant expectation of threat.
It's so clear how deep and whole body this is.
Hmm.
But importantly, the sources don't just leave us there. They really emphasize that healing is possible.
Yes, that's such a crucial message. And there are various paths. One area that really stood out in the material we reviewed was body-oriented therapy.
Right, there's that pilot study on something called the Trauma in the Body Group, the TBG.
Yes, which is an adaptation of a broader approach called sensorimotor psychotherapy.
And sensorimotor psychotherapy.
Yeah.
What's the core idea there?
Broadly, it integrates paying attention to the body sensations, posture, small movements into therapy. It's not just talk. The TBG adaptation in that study was a specific 20-session group therapy designed for women who had experienced chronic interpersonal trauma, often from childhood.
So what do they actually do in that kind of therapy?
The core idea is helping people learn to gently pay attention to their somatic experience, what's happening in their body, right here in the present moment. It's about carefully challenging that deep-seated avoidance of the body or of relationships because they've historically been sources of pain.
So instead of avoiding, you notice.
You notice, you track what your body is doing, what sensations are there, maybe explore tiny movements your body wants to make, but maybe learn to suppress, all within a safe, supportive group context.
And the study found it was helpful.
The pilot study showed some really encouraging results. Significant improvements in body awareness, reductions in anxiety symptoms, and also an increased ability both to soothe themselves and to receive soothing or support from others.
So it's about building skills.
Building skills like mindfulness of the body, self-soothing, and gradually widening that window of tolerance, the capacity to stay present with difficult feelings or sensations without getting totally overwhelmed or shutting down completely. It's really about helping the body feel like a safe place to be again.
Which connects to mindfulness more generally, right? That came up in other sources too.
It did. Mindfulness, that practice of intentionally paying attention to the present moment, your thoughts, feelings, body sensations, without judgment. Just observing.
And sources say that can help with?
It can help with grounding yourself when you feel overwhelmed, with regulating intense emotions, building self-compassion instead of self-criticism, and developing new coping strategies. It can be a really powerful tool for many people.
However, there are nuances, aren't there? Especially with complex trauma.
Huge nuances, yes.
Yeah.
This was really highlighted in a personal perspective we looked at, shared online by someone with complex trauma. Their point was, for some people, especially if you're constantly stuck in that fight, flight, freeze response, or if you dissociate a lot,
Just being told to be present might not work.
it might feel impossible. Or worse, it could be incredibly triggering. It could even feel invalidating, like a kind of spiritual bypassing or emotional neglect if it's pushed before a basic sense of safety has been established.
That's such an important caution.
It really is. That source made the crucial point that mindfulness isn't some magic bullet, especially for complex trauma. It needs to be introduced very carefully, very gently, often titrated, and usually works best alongside other trauma-informed therapies. They mention things like DBT or EMDR in that discussion.
So safety first, always.
Safety has to be paramount. Creating a felt sense of safety both within the person's own system and in the therapeutic relationship before diving deep into potentially activating present moment awareness.
Beyond these specific therapies, did the sources mention other practical things that help with healing?
Yes, definitely. Things like consciously working towards building healthy, supportive relationships, recognizing that safe connection can be profoundly healing.
Making sure kids have safe ways to express their feelings.
Crucial for prevention. Also, simply recognizing and naming the effects of trauma when they show up in your life, understanding why you react certain ways, can itself be empowering. Seeking professional help when needed, of course.
And basic self-care.
Absolutely. Which can look different for everyone. Maybe gentle movement or exercise, maybe creative activities, spending time in nature, practicing gentle mindfulness when it feels right. And for some people, connecting with their cultural history or family roots can be a really powerful part of reclaiming identity and healing.
Wow. Okay. We have covered a lot of ground today. It's really profound, isn't it? Seeing how trauma gets woven so deeply into everything, body, brain, emotions, relationships.
Even potentially flowing across generations. It's heavy stuff for sure.
It is. But what also comes through, I think, in all this material is this incredible sense of resilience.
Yes. There's definitely a strong thread of hope, highlighting the potential for healing, for change, whether it's through dedicated therapies like the body-focused one we talked about, or the countless other ways people find to reclaim their lives and their sense of self.
So maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to carry with you from this deep dive.
How might really understanding that trauma lives in the body, not just the mind, shift your perspective on what healing really looks like?
And maybe how central is creating a genuine feeling of safety. Safety inside yourself and safety in your connections with others. How central is that to the whole journey of healing?
Thank you so much for joining us and taking this deep dive with us today.
Yeah, thank you. If you found this exploration useful, or maybe just interesting, please do consider subscribing so you don't miss out on our future deep dives.
And we'd be really grateful if you could like this or share it with anyone else you think might benefit from hearing this perspective.
We also genuinely love hearing from you, so please feel free to leave a comment below with any thoughts or questions you might have.
Until the next deep dive, take good care of yourself.